Hello everyone, Alistair Gold here. I thought I could have a week off during the festive period and Tottenham would do what they normally do, which is go off and go on a bit of a roll and get themselves up the table. It hasn't been one of those festive periods. It's been pretty rubbish, hasn't it? All of the kind of goodwill, if we're going to keep with the festive theme, seems to have drained out of the side. Obviously, we've had the match at Middlesbrough today, which just lack of creativity, lack of ideas. I think there's a real, like I say, a confidence drain in the team, and I think it's one of those scenarios where you can only look at the players because it's exactly the same performances that were coming towards the end of the Pochettino era. You can't obviously the managers are to blame in certain aspects, of course they are. Certain decisions can be analysed, pored over and looked at time and time again, but ultimately it's up to the 11 players on the pitch, and the 11 players on the pitch today were good enough to do a job at Middlesbrough, albeit a Middlesbrough side that kind of picked up a bit of form in the last month or so. Were very well organised today, I thought they played well, but still the quality of the players that were put out there to do the job should have been good enough to do the job. And I think it's the lack of creativity that worries me the most, because that was something that Mourinho in the earlier weeks was able to bring back. Spurs were scoring goals. They were scoring plenty of goals. They were that was the whole point, wasn't it? They were outscoring the amount of goals they were leaking at the back. Now that has kind of pretty much disappeared as well. It leaves you with this quite worrying scenario where, yeah, it is very similar to the Pochettino kind of performances towards the end of a little bit of a fear, are they even going to score a goal? And when you're doing that against a championship side, that's no offence to them, because like I say, they did play very well. But Premier League team who, were Champions League finalists just, 6-7 months ago, they really shouldn't be struggling to even test the Middlesbrough keeper. I know he made a couple of decent saves in the second half, but overall his goal should be peppered with shots, and it just wasn't. I mean, I tweeted out at half time because it was one of those things I think a lot of people could see. Spurs don't have a player other than Eriksen, and he was obviously playing in a deeper role, that can just play that through ball. Pochettino used to call it having cojones, having the bravery to just thread a ball through. Don't care whether you're going to lose the ball, don't care whether the fans are going to get on your back, but just thinking an instant decision, that kind of instinct to play a quick through ball. And Spurs really, Celso and Lamela are those kind of players, that they were players that they were just aren't starting games. Celso isn't really. Lamela obviously is a fitness thing. He's now coming back. That was a longer kind of game for him now. Is it 35 minutes? Whether it's enough to start against Liverpool, I don't know, but he's got a week to kind of further work on his fitness. But when they don't have players like that on the pitch, or a player like that in those, preferably the three behind a striker, if that's how Spurs are playing, then they're going to struggle, because Dele Alli can kind of play that role, but we know it's not his best role. His best role's playing off the striker. Son and Lucas are more runners than creators, and you need a player like that, someone that pulls the strings just in the final third. If Eriksen is going to come back, Eriksen in his prime was doing that. There was no debate about it. It was one of the best in the Premier League. But at the moment, when he is featuring, Mourinho's using him in a deeper role alongside, it was Winks today, obviously. And you massively miss that player. Obviously, we thought towards the end of the Pochettino time that Celso was going to be the one. He had those couple of games where it looked really promising, and obviously Mourinho, it hasn't quite worked for him. Mourinho's playing this almost like a safe paint-by-numbers team, one that we know the names, we know what they can do, but ultimately on the pitch, it's not really working. And I mean, defensively, we can't get away from defence. He seems to have now, Davinson Sanchez has dropped out of the team, which I think was quite harsh, to be honest. I don't think he's been one of Spurs' worst defenders by a long shot. If anything, probably one of the better ones. I know some people get on his back, but I actually think in terms of just the actual defending, we know his passing can be a little bit ropey, but in terms of defending, I think he's kind of maybe stood above some of the other players. And when you've got, like today, we won't count Aurier because Aurier's at the pitch. Although Aurier had a decent game. I know I often will pick up and if Aurier's had a bit of a shocker, but I didn't feel he was that bad today. I thought he did some good things defensively, and obviously his cross, which we'll come to for the goal. But if you're looking at the rest of that defence, and you had Dyer, Alderweireld, and Vertonghen, they were just torn apart any time there was a little bit of pace, and that's got to be worrying to Mourinho. That's why I think you need a Sanchez to be in there with his extra pace, his like little burst of speed that he's got at the beginning of it. Even Foyth is probably quicker than them. Although I know another player who, this is the one of the worries maybe with the Mourinho era so far, is that perhaps you make a mistake and then you're kind of out and you're going to have to get yourself back in, or maybe certain players make mistakes and they're out. Obviously, we know Aurier has made mistakes aplenty but keeps getting back in, but that could be because of lack of people maybe to play in that position. But that worries me. That trio, kind of as soon as I saw it, I just thought, oh God, if they knock any balls over the top, they are not going to be able to turn and catch up. Dyer has never been blessed with pace. I think he's got a bit of speed when he gets going, but it's that initial getting going which is the struggle. Vertonghen and Alderweireld, obviously, we know these are guys in their 30s now who it just isn't quite there, the pace anymore that they might have had beforehand. So there's so much to work on. I thought Sessegnon, was quite good in defensive scenarios, albeit a couple of times I thought he maybe just got turned a little bit too easily. But my worry with him is it's a little bit like Kyle Walker-Peters was suffering from. And he gets into really good positions, he's got the pace, he's got the kind of instinct to get into that final third. But whether it's a confidence thing, as soon as they get into positions to actually be helpful, kind of cut inside and just play a safe ball into someone in the midfield. Something Walker-Peters did, which absolutely aggravated me because he's a guy that can do so much more. We've seen the assists he's racked up in very few performances. But whether it was just a consequence of kind of things going wrong in other matches, his confidence being knocked to pieces, and I kind of feel like Sessegnon's starting to go that way, which is a real shame because, especially playing a championship team in Middlesbrough, this is where he's obviously come from with Fulham originally. He knows how to tear these championship teams apart. That worried me slightly. I hope that's something that can be fixed. Maybe it needs a great assist or another goal or something like that. But I quite like him in that wing back role. I think he can play really, really well there. I think that's probably the best of both worlds for Sessegnon. But he's got to have the confidence to do it as well. But as I keep going on about, and I hate to labour a point, but I just think it's one of those, it's so blindingly kind of seems to be obvious to everyone, maybe apart from certain people in the club, is that Pochettino just went on and on and on about this team needing to have a rebuild, a refresh, a Tottenham 6.0, I think he called it. He went on for it for about 2 years. And now we're at the same stage, same scenario, different manager in another transfer window where all the kind of signs are that Spurs are not going to be particularly, they're not going to be proactive. That's the term that's been used by various people inside the club and public figures as well. And you just think, when's the refresh? When's the rebuild going to happen? It's a club that is screaming out for a refresh. They wouldn't give it to the man Pochettino who wanted to do it. He got a couple of players, 2 of them injured for most of the time. And now you've got a new manager. If anything, a new manager. However much Mourinho says, I don't need new players. We know that squad is absolutely. If it was a runner in a race, it's kind of bending over by the side of the race, panting and struggling for air. It really is. It needs a second wind, fresh blood into it, just to kind of sort itself out, because the future is looking a little bit worrying. You see performances like this, and it's now. That was through much of 2019 we had these performances, and now they're continuing into 2020 or 2020. It can just be fixed with just a little bit of foresight and planning. And I know, this window is going to be one of those where I think they'll look to get rid of fringe players. If Eriksen can go, certainly journalists I know in Denmark are insistent that the Inter Milan stuff is a goer and that they are really trying to push it so he comes in this window. Whether that happens, whether his agent or the player wants to actually leave this window, which it's a funny one because he's now actually starting again for Spurs. I wouldn't say he's been as horrific as he was, and that very well where he could quite easily say, well, that's because I've been getting minutes and I'll be able to get a bit sharper. Set pieces are still ropey as hell, but I do feel he's contributing a bit more, and I do think you notice when he's not there. And if he does go, Spurs are really, really going to have to look for a replacement because Celso, I think, has the potential to be that. He can play in that deeper role, that more attacking role. I'm not entirely sure whether Mourinho believes that yet, but I thought he looked bright today. You know, I think players like Ali and Son looked a little bit, well below par really today. I thought Lucas scored a great goal. I think that's what he does. For me, the most frustrating thing about Lucas is that his main ability seems to be scoring goals, but he's a winger. And I think if he was a striker, that would be brilliant on its own. But I think as a winger, you kind of want a lot more from him. And I kind of felt up until the goal, he gets in some great positions. He's such a trier. He's such a hard-working player, wins headers as well, despite he's not being the tallest guy in the world. But I think what I'd say about Lucas, he's an incredibly intelligent guy. You know, been fortunate enough to have a few interviews with him, speaks numerous languages, but when it comes to on-pitch decisions, often he doesn't do the most intelligent things. And I think there's such a player in there. And if you think, like, there was a couple of positions today he got into where he just had to just play a good square ball or a little dinked cross or something, and it just didn't happen for him. I don't want to do him down too much because his goal was fantastic. Positioning, his movement, the header was lovely. But I just think as a winger, you just want more. He should be doing that and assisting others. He should be creating chances for other players as well because he's got it in him. I just think it's like I say, it's about decision making with him. And I just feel Spurs need just that little bit of magic, a little bit of that's really what they're missing, isn't it? It's someone that can take the game by the scruff of the neck. You think, you know, Lo Celso could be that guy, as I've said, but like I've just said about Eriksen, maybe it's a case of getting minutes. He needs minutes under his belt. I think the most glaring thing, obviously, we saw today is the absence of Harry Kane. There's this bizarre thing about how some people think Spurs play better without Harry Kane. They don't. Harry Kane is a world-class striker. He is one of the best strikers in the world. I think the difference maybe, and I'd hope to see it today, is that if you take Kane out of the team, they lose that easy option of a hoofed ball up the top of the pitch. And they have to play the ball through. And that's what I hoped you might see. I think that's maybe sometimes what people, when they say Spurs play better, is because maybe they play the ball on the floor a little bit more. But that's not Kane's fault. That's people looking at him as an easy option to bypass the midfield with one of those big kind of lofted clearances which just do no one any good whatsoever. I think you play with the ball on the floor with Kane up there, then, well, we saw under Pochettino, that's one of the best versions of Tottenham Hotspur. But I think the biggest fail from the club, obviously, has been not bringing in another striker. Whoever's fault that was, whether that was Pochettino, I don't personally feel it was, because certainly in pre-season I remember asking him about whether Troy Parrott would end up being the backup striker, because Llorente obviously was on the way out, and he was like, well, if we get no one else in, then yes, he will be. It wasn't the most full answer of, you know, trying to deny that he wanted a striker. It kind of felt to me that he was a guy that was saying, well, obviously I'd like another striker, but if I don't, then Troy's there. I think the thing with Troy Parrott, he was on the bench again today. There's a lot of calls for him, and obviously I've been fortunate enough to see a lot of him, but he's still 17 years old, and he very much is a raw product. If you see, Pochettino obviously had this reputation for bringing through young players and playing them, and now you see Mourinho, who in recent years he'll point out to you has brought through some good young players, despite kind of the rhetoric about him. Neither of those are throwing Troy Parrott into the mix. I think it tells you that it's just he's not quite ready for it yet. He's got plenty of talent, and all the sounds are all the noises he's going to sign a new deal. But he's 17 years old, and I know there's this adage of, Pochettino said it, if you're good enough, you're old enough. I just feel with him, they don't want to throw him into a struggling Tottenham team and then sap his confidence and stunt his development. I've said this before, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but Spurs should have fixed this. There should have been a new striker come in. They just should have. Llorente, you know, he got a bit of flack in his first season, but in the second season, you could kind of see the point in him. You're not going to... The problem with the striker role, and it's so well known, we sometimes forget it when we get all excited about various transfers that we could see that come to Spurs. Ultimately, Harry Kane will always, until he leaves the club or wants to leave the club or retires or whatever, will be Tottenham's main striker. And Spurs very rarely play with two up front. They just don't. So that means whoever coming in is going to be a player who is not going to play very many games if he's an out-and-out striker. It's just the way it is. So that means you're left with two different kinds of strikers. Well, technically three. You're left with an older striker, like a Llorente type, who accepts that their career is kind of winding towards its end and they're happy to play more of a backup role. You can go for a younger striker, who at the time was Vincent Janssen. Someone who is just delighted to make that step up to a big club and also accept that they're going to learn as they go along. The third type is that kind of hybrid player, someone like a Son or a Martial when Spurs used to look at him, someone who can play as an out-and-out striker if you need them to be, but also they're going to get game time in kind of wide positions as well if you need it, which really does it cuts down who you're looking at. There's certain strikers that I think would be good enough for Spurs, but then you look at it and you wonder, would they want to cut down on their playing time? I remember Pochettino telling us in pre-season the story of how he spoke to Alvaro Morata, who I think then was before he moved to Chelsea. And he was just trying to convince Morata that, you will get game time. But he said there's this fear that strikers know Harry Kane is the be-all and end-all of the Tottenham attack, and they are going to play, he's going to play almost every match he wants to, because he's so bloody good. So it is a difficult position to bring players into, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And there are players out there. If you've got to overspend slightly more on maybe a younger guy from the Championship or something like that, or a player from another league that is going to just accept that move up, or a more experienced player who might cost you a bit more in wages, like Llorente did. Obviously, you got Dries Mertens out in. He's in Italy. Is he in Italy? I think at the moment. I think he's coming towards the end of his deal. Players like that who can do a job for you. And I think it's at times like this when Kane, we know he's going to get injuries because he plays so much. It's just a stupid vicious circle, and we know that Kane is going to pick up more and more injuries. Ankle obviously is an issue. His hamstring now he's done. I think he's had a hamstring one before as well, hasn't he? It's very much a case of, if you're going to play him that many times, you need someone who's ready to come in. And clearly Troy Parrott isn't quite yet. Hopefully he will be. I think he's going to be a wonderful striker as he gets older. But you need to bring someone in. They need to address that. It's not rocket science. And I think it's one of those scenarios where I think maybe the fans have to accept that it doesn't have to be the most exciting player in the world. It doesn't have to be a world-class, stunning, breathtaking signing. It just needs to be someone that can do that role of just holding the ball up for other players. That's what they miss most. Kane's hold-up play is phenomenal. We've all seen it when he has his back to the goal, spins with the ball, plays a ball out to the wings, or even plays a chip ball through to someone else running on like Ali. Very few players can do that and score goals like Kane does. So maybe you need to have someone who's maybe not going to score as many goals, but will hold up that ball and bring others into play. And that was obviously what they tried to get out of Llorente. I know there's injuries as well. We look at the midfield is pretty much mullered at the moment, isn't it? It's Sissoko's out, Ondembele's out. Obviously, elsewhere in the pitch, you've got Lloris, Kane, Danny Rose, Ben Davies. It's a big injury list. There's no getting away from it. And there's this difficulty in clubs. Clubs are always really wary of signing new players when they've got other players who will come back, because then they end up with this bloated squad with a massive kind of wage package for the whole of them. But I think if they want to get rid of the likes of Wanyama, does he even exist anymore? It's kind of, it doesn't even appear to kind of be involved with matches like this. In the Pochettino era, he would have got minutes, and he's not even anywhere near the team. So obviously you're going to move him on hopefully this month. Eriksen, the club want to move on. You do wonder whether someone like Walker Peters is going to go out on loan. We know Jack Clark's going to go back out on loan. Trying to think who else is there. Whether they decide to give Skip a loan as well, just to kind of get him some first team experience. Because I think that was another thing that was disappointing about today, is you saw the players that rocked up on the coach. You had So many academy prospects. You had Dennis Sirkin turn out the left back. He was there as like the 19th man. Troy Parrott, Jaffet Tanganga, Skip, Winks, Alfie Whiteman. Winks was the only one that played, and I think that's. I know it's this really weird scenario where kind of you want Spurs to put out their best team, but you also need a little bit of inspiration from somewhere. And sometimes I do think homegrown players can do that. I know I was saying about Parrott not being a backup to start matches, but even chucking him on for the last 10 minutes, I don't think would have done anyone any harm because it doesn't affect you in the defensive side of the pitch, but it can just give you that little bit of an extra body up top when Spurs were struggling to even get the ball towards the goal. I know obviously Lucas scored the goal and had that other curler from distance, but in terms of shots actually on target, not sure entirely what the stats were, but I'd imagine it was very, very low. Gazzaniga, he pulled off 2 saves and Alderweireld cleared one off his line all within the one moment. And Spurs didn't have many moments like that at all. I think the key sentence I know Mourinho said, and I think Levy said it as well. No, actually Levy didn't. Levy just keeps referring to Mourinho's words. But Mourinho says, the club are going to be reactive, not proactive. And I think that worries me is that how after 2 years of seeing or being told by Pochettino that a squad needed rebuilding, how are you not being proactive in fixing that? It's just basic, you'd think, squad management. We know this team's need a refresh for a long, long time, and it just worries me. It does worry me slightly because they're going to muddle through another transfer window and just make do with what they've got. Mourinho isn't like Pochettino had a big thing about the January window. He didn't like having to assimilate players into his team mid-season because they hadn't had the pre-season, which was ironic because very few Spurs players get pre-seasons if they're new signings because they're signed so late. But he just felt by the time they're actually adjusted to the Premier League, it's the end of the season. Mourinho doesn't seem to share that belief. I haven't heard anything from him that suggests similar. So you'd be stunned if he didn't want like a player or two. And I think ultimately the goal is, I think Levy said it, didn't he, at the Christmas do? He told the crowd he wants top 4 and a trophy. They're going to get neither if they don't refresh your squad in some way because it needs life. It needs, like I say, it's a little bit of magic in there. And if you lose Eriksen as well, despite his critics, you're losing a player who's provided pretty much the bulk of Spurs' creativity and assists over the last 5-6 years. He does need to replace. Celso won't be able to do it all on his own. He's a player who's adapting. I still do feel that he'll become a permanent Spurs player. I think that will happen. But it's about how he develops and also just get him some help in there. Spurs need to approach this transfer window in a more, if they want to say they're being reactive, well, react to what's happening at Tottenham Hotspur this season because it's just not good enough. And it's the same set of players that are struggling. And that has to tell you need a fresh injection of something. And they've tried injecting a fresh manager and it hasn't worked thus far other than a little kind of jump. But when it's come to kind of be in the big matches, it hasn't happened. And I say big matches, we're talking about Southampton being defeated at Southampton, talking about being held to a draw by a championship side in Middlesbrough, who have struggled for a lot of this season until the last month. It's not good enough. It's just not at all. They need to get going and not, wait for these last minute. I know it's harder to do deals in January. I know it's tougher. But just, even if it's just one player that makes that difference, then it was worth going for. If it costs money, if it costs them a little bit of money or a little bit extra money, that could be the difference between getting top 4 and the riches that come with Europe. Could be the difference between winning a cup, the silver where they've coveted for so long. They can't sit on their hands. It's got to be a transfer window, I think, where Spurs do something. Liverpool up next. If Liverpool pull off the result that I'm sure many Spurs fans will be dreading, it's only going to be highlighted even further, and it's just going to be even clearer. Something needs to happen, and they've tried the manager. It's got to be the players now. So let's see what January brings. Hopefully some good news. Talk to you later.